all that many injuries coming from using regular glass. Most of these showers in the older buildings have regular glass. They don't have safety glass. There aren't a lot of accidents. And it's too burdensome to tell us we all now have to install safety glass in every shower enclosure. It's going to cost a lot of money. The money's going to be passed on to tenants. Tenants don't have a lot of money. The risk is not worth all that expense and burden. The court disagreed. The court said it's not that costly anymore, and it is very dangerous, and the time has come to where the risk does outweigh the burden. You can share that cost around. It's not that burdensome. It is. You are risking grave injury, as in the actual case, and they decided that from now on that's negligent conduct. But to properly assess that, it's not only the burden on this defendant in this building, it's now the burden in the state of New York with everyone who's got a glass enclosure. They've all got to put in safety glass. That is some burden. So you're constantly measuring risk against burdens that you're imposing and deciding whether conduct is reasonable under the circumstances. That's the ordinary way of approaching breach that'll work in most cases. But we saw with professionals, it's hard to decide these things. What should an anesthesiologist be doing when a blood level reaches a certain amount that they're monitoring? The fact is we don't know. We don't know what's reasonable for anesthesiologists. We don't know what's reasonable for a brain surgeon. We don't know what's reasonable for an electrical engineer putting together electrical components. So with professionals, the courts have a slightly different approach. The standard is still the same. Did they use reasonable care under the circumstances? Or did they breach their duty? They failed to use reasonable care. The answer of lay people is we don't know. So the courts say, well, did they use the care that ordinary members in good standing in their profession used? That's enough for us. It's actually a customary practice. Did they use the customary practice of good professionals in that field? If they did, they're acting reasonably. Mistakes happen, there are side effects to everything. We're not going to say they were negligent. But if they fell below that standard, they somehow failed to use the care that an ordinary doctor in good standing would have used, that becomes the standard for professionals that you want to apply. What we mean by professional is someone whose conduct is complicated enough that we call them professionals and that we can't tell whether they're acting reasonably or not. If you call a cook a professional, or you call a cab driver a professional, they are professionals. But the court probably won't apply the professional standard because what they're doing is not so complicated that we can't tell what's careful and what's careless. So it's for the professions where it's difficult to tell. Again, the standard is, did the professional use the care that ordinary professionals of that profession in good standing would have used? If it's a doctor, you're suing a doctor for malpractice, did the doctor use the kind of care under those circumstances that other doctors in good standing would have used? If it's a pilot, did the pilot use the care that other pilots in good standing would have used? It's a simple standard. It's often, like we said, difficult to decide that. And where it's difficult, you need an expert. In medical cases, generally you need an expert who will tell you what doctors in good standing would have done. Without an expert, the plaintiff won't have enough evidence that the jury can reach a rational conclusion about that. In certain cases, it's obvious. So if it's obvious enough to a layman that the doctor did not use the care that doctors in good standing would have used, then it'll get to the jury and the jury will be to decide. That's where the doctor, after sewing you up, leaves some of the instruments in that they were using in the operation. You don't need a medical expert for that to know that's negligent. But generally you do. So if you have a professional in the fact pattern, first, how are you going to go wrong on that? By not stating the standard correctly. There are various ways of putting it. The restatement elaborates. They say, does the professional possess and exercise the knowledge and skill that ordinary professionals in good standing would have possessed and exercised? Any way you come up with that's adequate, I'll recognize. But you need to know how to state the professional standard of deciding when reasonable care is used or not used. In certain cases, even though it's a professional, it's a doctor, the court uses a different standard, and that's the doctrine of informed consent. It's only applied in medical situations. Again, the standard of care has not changed. It's whether you use reasonable care under the circumstances. But the courts have decided they're not going to let doctors decide this by doctors in good standing. The court imposes its own rules upon the medical profession, upsetting them greatly, and they oppose this, but that's what the courts have done. It's a general rule. In obtaining consent to medical treatment, the courts have imposed upon doctors the duty to adequately inform the patient in obtaining their consent of the material risks of the treatment being proposed and its alternatives, of alternative treatments and of doing nothing. In other words, they're saying inform the patient of the risks, and if you don't inform the patients of the risks, then you're negligent. They consented, you didn't inform them of the risk happened. You were negligent. So we're dealing with situations where something has happened to the patient who's now a plaintiff. And that patient is saying, I was never informed that this was a risk, and it happened to me. If it never happens, this doctor doesn't come up. The doctor is not telling the first case we saw, there's a risk of incontinence if you agree to this surgery. It can happen. It may be rare, but there is some risk of incontinence. They didn't tell the patient of that. The court said, you have a duty. We don't care what you professionals in good standing do. You've got a duty to inform of all material risks unknown to the patient of the treatment you're proposing and its alternatives. If you don't do that, you've breached your duty of reasonable care. So it's a doctrine of informed consent. It comes up only in medical situations where there's something that the plaintiff's claiming they're not informed of, and it was a risk that occurred, and they weren't told about it. It's got to be a material risk. It's got to be unknown to the patient. You know, if there's some risk of bleeding, we all know about it. They don't have to inform you of that. So it's a material risk unknown to the patient of the treatment and its alternatives. That's going to be a breach regardless of the professional standard. Are there any exceptions to that? Yes. In emergency situations, we already seen this in the consent part of your outline. Can we imply that there is consent to medical treatment? How much more time do we have, Marvin?
Would you want to go for another half an hour or what?
Well, how much time have we gone?
46 minutes.
Yeah, well, let's go for at least an hour.
Okay.
Emergency consent, there are 4 requirements. The patient is incapable of consenting. You know, they're unconscious, they're mentally disabled, they're a child who can't consent without their parents, and you can't get the parents. So you're in a situation where they're not capable of consenting, but it's an emergency. There's a risk of serious imminent harm. And a reasonable person would consent under these circumstances. If you just get a hold of them, and if they were capable, a reasonable person would consent. That's the 3rd requirement. And then the 4th requirement. You're not on notice that this individual would not consent. If it's a child, you're not on notice that the parents would not consent. That becomes a stickler on any reasonable person would consent, but these people are not going to consent. They don't have to consent to medical treatment, and you're operating at risk unless you can meet these requirements. You say, but they weren't capable of consenting, they were unconscious, it was an emergency, there's a risk of serious harm. Any reasonable person would have consented to the treatment I was about to do. And I wasn't on any notice that this person was a Jehovah's Witness who's against transfusions or against treatment. I wasn't on any notice. So 4 requirements. No notice, reasonable person would. This person's incapable, and it's an emergency. Emergency means imminent serious harm. Then you obviously don't have any doctrine of informed consent. The only other situation, where I haven't actually seen a case of it, but the courts talk about it, is if informing the person of these risks would be detrimental to their health. They must somehow be so emotionally unstable that telling them of all these risks will push them over the edge, and it would be detrimental to their health to inform them of the risk. There's 2 requirements where it's detrimental. It would be detrimental to their health to do it, and professionals in good standing would not do it because it was detrimental. So if informing is detrimental, 2 requirements. Those are the only 2 exceptions to the informed consent doctrine. Okay, so we've done learned hand, professional standard, and informed consent. The next one is children. Here the standard does change. we're not using a reasonable person standard. With children, the courts say we got to